Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Learning Salon. We are very excited to host Fedorenko from MIT today. And John will give a more broader introduction to Ev. I will first start by, once he's done eating, I will first start by reminding everyone that the Learning Salon is a forum in which we discuss bridges and contentions between biological and artificial learning. It's an interdisciplinary forum, so if you have any questions that are because you're in a different field, it is totally welcome. Do not think that your question is stupid just because this is not the main field that you work in. There is an ask a question area below. Please press the button, put your questions there, vote on each other's question. If you don't want to be invited to screen, please say ask for me so that we know who are the people who want to ask their questions on screen. Another thing I would say is that definitely let's make sure to be very respectful of one another in the questions. Disagreement is encouraged. This is not a place for unnecessary politeness, but respectfulness is important. So we definitely won't fault anyone for disagreeing, but make sure that your arguments are well reasoned, that there is no personal attacks, and that things are intellectual. There's good intellectual sportsmanship. Today is February 25th, 2022, and it's been a crazy week. The news from Russia and Ukraine has been challenging a lot of people, not just those of us who have been in the war, but also just, the destabilization of the global dynamics is kind of scary for everyone, especially now that it seems like COVID is becoming just slightly less scary than it was 5 months ago. So consider us, in a part of your challenges. Share anything if you wanted. Reach out to your friends, reach out to others, and don't underestimate the stressors that these kinds of global dynamics have on you. I think that we are definitely ready for John's introduction, if he is now.
Yes, thanks, Ida. So, we have a tradition here at the Learning Salon that we don't just list through people's credentials, and thank God, because I'd be here forever with Ev. I actually had been reading Ev before I knew her, and then I was lucky enough to be on a study section with Ev at the NSF, and it was incredibly stimulating to be able to talk about cognitive neuroscience with people like Ev. Also, I have to say that I've been, because I'm a stroke neurologist, you can basically divide people who are interested sort of like in motor deficits and language deficits. I mean, there are other ones in stroke, obviously, but aphasia and hemiparesis are huge. I've been really lucky in my life to spend a lot of time with people who study aphasia, and I've always found it fascinating. And I think that what I was struck by reading Ev's work and listening to her give talks is there really does seem to be an incredibly exciting next gen of cognitive scientists studying language in health and disease and bringing together really high quality neuropsychological work, computational work, and just making it be even more something that I look over and go, maybe I should have done language rather than motor. But I just think that it's just been very inspiring, and I've been very interested in what Ev has to say about this age-old debate of what comes first, language or thought, and how much is one dependent on the other. She wrote a paper which I cite and talk about all the time. I think it was in the New York Academy of Sciences, about aphasic patients who have a lot, surprisingly intact cognition outside language testing, right? Which is really fascinating. And I think I'm very much on Ev's side of that question. And I think that may come up, I'm not sure. So I just think that it's very exciting suddenly to be in language and cognition, and obviously with NLP and everything that's going on. So I just find this nexus very exciting. And I think Ev really is at the beating heart center of it. And we couldn't hope to hear from someone better.
Thank you, John. That's so kind. Should I go ahead and share? You guys can hear me okay? So I'll do just like a 10, 12 minute setup. Okay, so I know people here come from diverse backgrounds, so I'll try to not use any specific terms that may be unfamiliar, but please jump in if I say anything that doesn't make sense. So I want to start with the importance of methods. Methods are often kind of shoved to the side in science as secondary to the questions we ask. And although I fully agree that questions, of course, are the things that drive science and drive progress, I think without good, rigorous methods, there's just not much progress you could make. And so I want to start by showing you 6 individual maps of the language system. So these are just 6 random neurotypical individuals we've scanned sometime in the last bunch of years. And what you can probably appreciate, even if you are not familiar with, kind of not used to looking at activation maps for this particular system, is that although the broad landscape is similar, right? You see some blobs in the front, often looks kind of like 3 little blobs in the frontal lobe, and then a swath of activity along the lateral temporal cortex. But there's a lot of variability in where exactly these regions land. And so I began my career by trying to emphasize this high variability, which is not news. We've known this for centuries. People like Brodmann, who were mapping out the site architecture, were noting that where exactly site architectonic zones land relative to things like folds, basically gyra and salsa, is quite variable, especially in the association cortex. And so I've tried to introduce to the field of language research an approach where we identify these areas in individual brains. And this approach has been very fruitful in other domains that are much more strongly grounded in animal physiology. But to try to, so this is kind of everything the things I'll tell you about that we've discovered very briefly, a few of the things that we found. Is all based on these individual subject level analyses. But because we also would like to be able to connect to people who use traditional approaches where you average brains together, we've also developed this probabilistic language atlas based on over 800 people that we've scanned, where we basically are overlaying these individual landscapes to create this probabilistic map so that for any given point in the space, we can estimate its likelihood of falling within the language system. And in this way, we can interpret activation peaks from past studies, stroke locations, maybe even figure out which bits in postmortem braids are most likely to correspond to language cortex so that we can do, RNA-seq type analyses. So just a few words about the system. We can find it very quickly by contrasting neural responses to people reading or listening to language versus some perceptually matched control condition to subtract out kind of lower level perceptual processes. So it can be listening to your native language versus some unfamiliar language, or reading sentences versus sequences of pseudo words like florp and blicket, which you can't really interpret. And the system is active during both comprehension, no matter if it's auditory or visual, as in reading or processing sign languages. Similarly, in production, no matter if you're speaking or writing. Together, these two things suggest that the system likely stores language knowledge representations, which of course can be used to both interpret incoming signals and generate outgoing ones. The system appears similar across typologically diverse languages. The regions of the system are strongly anatomically and functionally connected, suggesting that they work together in the service of a common goal. And they're causally important for language, at least a subset of the system is, so that if you damage it in adulthood, you have problems in language comprehension, production, or both. And the 3 things I just want to kind of give you little tastes of that we found, and for some of this, there's nice converging evidence from other groups, are the following 3. So one is perhaps what our group is still most known for, which is establishing the extreme specificity or selectivity of these language processing mechanisms. So I'll start with that. And there's 2 sources of data you can use to establish how different, how distinct or overlapping particular cognitive mechanisms are. One is functional fMRI. This is something fMRI is actually really good for. And so we can do something like find language regions in any individual brain, John's brain, Ida's brain, my brain, and ask, do these same regions that work really hard when we process language? So here's a response. 0 here is just blank screen, some low-level baseline. Here's a response to language in dark gray, and the gray bar is a backward speech condition or non-words condition, something like that. And we can say, do these same regions work hard when you listen to music or are doing a math problem, or are categorizing objects as belonging to a particular class or not? And so in different colors, this is now pulling data from a couple dozen experiments we've conducted over the last decade. And in all of them, these language regions are defined in an individual person, and then we extract the strength of responses to other non-linguistic conditions. And so in different colors, we have a bunch of visual conditions here in yellow, a bunch of different auditory conditions, including music in lighter orange, some motor production conditions, so moving your hands, moving your articulators, some math problems, mathematical cognition, processing computer code, working memory and inhibitory control type tasks, categorization tasks, and visual event semantics, so understanding events in pictures or videos with no linguistic information. And what this graph tells you is that this system that works really hard when you process sentences, it works about as hard when you're doing a math problem or listening to music as it does when you're looking at a blank screen with no other stimuli. So it's really, really very selectively engaged in language. If we draw a line from this control backward speech or foreign speech condition across these conditions, you can see that the only conditions that elicit a response above this level are these visual event semantic conditions, so understanding of meanings in pictures. It's still much lower than the response elicited by language, and as I'll tell you in a second, it doesn't seem like this response is critically important. So the second method for getting at the question of overlap between language and other things is looking at patients with aphasia, especially with severe aphasia, where there is effectively no language abilities left. So this is typically due to a major stroke to the left hemisphere. And my friend and colleague Rosemary Varley has been studying this population for a bunch of years now, and we've done some work collaboratively in the last several years. And strikingly, well, depending on your prior beliefs, it may be less or more striking, but it was to me initially. Now I've kind of incorporated this into my worldview. In spite of this near complete loss of linguistic ability, so these people can't understand or produce language, they can do math and logic problems. They have perfectly intact executive abilities like working memory. They can understand structure and music. They're socially and emotionally sophisticated, and they have a rich understanding of how the world works, including extracting meaning from pictures of events, the condition that elicits a somewhat higher response in language regions than some of the other non-linguistic ones. Okay, so that's the first bit. Language appears to be quite separate from a bunch of non-linguistic machinery, including machinery that supports complex thought. For the second point, I'm not going to show you any data. I'm just going to say a few words. There has long been a search for a brain mechanism that supports combinatorial processing in language. And some have argued that this mechanism is more domain general, like it supports hierarchical processing maybe in language, but other domains like math and music and so on. And I've searched for such mechanisms for a long time. I also came into the field thinking that that's quite likely, and it was at least a hypothesis worth evaluating. And those things just don't exist. Instead, it seems that combinatorial processing is distributed across the whole language system. Wherever in the system you probe, you find robust sensitivity to combinatorics. But more importantly, any bit of the language system, which, like I said, is pretty much every bit of the language system, which shows sensitivity to combinatorial structure, like responding more to structured than unstructured stimuli, is also very sensitive to individual word meanings. So responding more to real words like, table and run compared to blicket and florp, suggesting that it's the very same circuits, brain regions, same network that stores our knowledge of words, what words mean, are also supporting this process of combining words into phrases and sentences. And two more words about this last point, which I'm extremely excited about. This is work that just kind of started, 2-3 years ago, and is now a big direction in my group. So as I'm sure you guys have talked about in this venue before, there's been huge advances in artificial intelligence, in including natural language processing, such that some language models are now quite impressive at various language tasks. And we decided to try. So this project was led by Martin Schrimpf, then a graduate student, now a postdoc in the department, who's been doing similar kinds of things in vision. And he had this idea to try to apply this approach to language, to try to see if we can use these artificial language models to capture something about how human brains do language, and then potentially leverage knowledge of how these models are structured to make inferences about how the brain may be solving the same problems. And I'm gonna, I'll just say a couple of things. And the approach here is very straightforward. This approach is many models, many data sets approach, or what Martin Schrimpf calls integrative benchmarking. And the idea is you basically get the stimuli that humans processed while their brain activity was recorded. You feed the same stimuli to models. Then you train a regression from the models to humans, and then you see how well that model generalizes to unseen human neural data. And it turns out that this is just a graph showing performance in predicting brain activity in the language system across 40 plus models. And you can see that some models are basically getting to our noise normalized ceiling. So they're really good at capturing whatever variability we have in responding in human language systems responses. Yeah, and
Sorry.
I'm
Sorry,
finishing. We can.
Oh, no, I'm not. You can take a lot longer. I'm wondering why the percentages are error bars.
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, it means that our estimation of ceiling is not quite right. So how we estimate ceiling is how a lot of other people estimate ceiling, and we're discussing in the lab alternative approaches at the moment. But what you usually do is you try to predict any given individual's brain responses from other individuals' brain responses, with the idea that that's about as good as you can expect to explain human neural activity compared to some external model, like a BERT or GPT-2 or something like that.
So
and that may not be quite the right thing to do.
I'm a little still confused. So this is comparing. So the y-axis, could you explain a little bit again? Is it the next word, or what is the predictivity? Thank you.
So this is normalized neural predictivity. So this is how well a model captures responses in the human brains. This is in a particular fMRI data set, but it looks similar in other data sets. So real ceiling in these data is between 0.2 and 0.3 in general in data for language. And then you're trying to get these unit weights from models. We take their best performing layer, and then we train a linear regression from those unit weights to whatever neural units were recorded in the human experiment. So it can be a set of voxels, it can be electrodes from an intracranial recording session, and you're trying to basically find some linear combination such that there is a mapping established. And then once you train that regression, you apply it to some unseen human neural data and see how well it can capture responses to particular sentences or stories or something like that.
I think we're going to return to this and ask a lot of questions, because
that's fine.
The choice of the nodes, the weights, how the weights are extracted from GPT, none of these are like, trivial. And Melanie's also not clear about what responses in the human brain means, same as me. So we will ask again.
Sure. So I'll just okay. So I'll say, okay, it seems that there's a lot of variance across these models. I mean, some are like very simple decontextualized embeddings like Word2Vec, and some go to things like GPT-2 XL. But then importantly, one thing that we were especially interested in is whether models that do best on predicting the next word in a sequence, which is a task that these models are generally trained on, whether this performance on this computational objective determines how well that model captures human neural responses. Okay, so this is similar to, for example, in vision, saying, okay, do the models that best do object recognition also capture activity in the ventral visual stream? It's a parallel question for language. And so now here I'll show you a scatter plot. On the x-axis is now how well a model does on next word prediction. So lower is here better. This is perplexity. And on the y-axis is the same values I was just showing you, how well a model predicts human neural data. And you find a nice strong relationship. So the models that do well on next word prediction are also ones that best capture human neural responses. It's not simply because there's more parameters, the models are larger that do better on next word prediction. You can take an embedding of the same dimensionality with no architectural priors, and that doesn't do well at all in predicting human neural responses, suggesting there is something about the information flow through the network and some combination of training that are needed. So yeah, so those are the three things that I just want to kind of lay out there. High specialization for language. So language is separate from other aspects of perception, motor control, and cognition, including complex thought and reasoning. No specialized syntactic mechanisms. So strong integration between the processing of word meanings and the processing of compositional structure. And this intriguing recent result suggesting that some artificial neural network models provide a reasonable fit to human neural data, suggesting that they can be then probed to try to understand what it is about their internals that makes them provide a good fit. But so far from the thing I told you, it seems that maybe next word prediction is a good objective for both biological and in silico models. And here's all my wonderful labbies, my lab family, and our collaborators. So I'm going to stop sharing and happy to talk to you guys or reshare, whatever.
Thank you so much.
Great.
So I have a lot of clarification questions.
Sure, go for it.
But I'm not going to start. I'm going to let John start just first. And people are going to start throwing in their claps. As you can, I don't know if you can see the chat now.
Yeah, I can see it now. Mm-hmm.
So John, please go ahead.
Can you hear me, Ev?
Yes.
So, this is like having a giant, delicious cake and not knowing where to start, right? It's just all so fascinating.
I'm glad.
But I'm going to just ask. I have a bunch of questions, and I'm going to try and go through them because they're all, and they all relate to each of the three green boxes of yours. One is this issue of functional integration and common goal, right? I mean, I always find in this whole field of cognitive science, when people talk about an area that does something versus area A, B plus C do the thing, it's not A, B, and C alone, right? And I always wonder when we say that, because in a way, you could argue that when I walk, my goal is a functional integration of my brain, my spinal cord, my muscles, and my legs, right? So it can become banal, right? That I need my legs to functionally integrate to move. So in other words, when does functional integration for a common goal really mean that the computation cannot be supported unless the areas do it all together, versus that the goal is assembled by areas that are independent, just like my legs are not involved in my motor cortical computation? So I just want to know what you actually mean by functional integration, because there's a banal version, right? Yeah. And then there's one where you're actually making a claim that sometimes the computation has to be areas combined. So which one?
It's a very good question. So the question about natural kinds, right? What counts as a meaningful natural kind in the mind and brain and elsewhere? I come from a tradition where we used to think about the brain as made up of distinct functional areas because I was trained in the vision lab. And in fact, in vision, it seems that there are clear functional subdivisions among different parts, different stages in the visual stream. And there's some such subdivisions in language processing as well. Like, for example, before linguistic incomprehension, before the language system gets into the system that I was talking about, it's processed by perceptual speech areas. Those are totally functionally distinct. They don't care at all about the meaning. They'll respond just as much to English as to Tagalog or whatever. I don't know, maybe you speak Tagalog, but I don't. So in me, they will respond just as much to English as they do to some unfamiliar language or non-words or something like that. They just care about the acoustics. Then the information, so those serve as input to this higher level language processing system. And I spent, like pretty much my entire career trying to figure out whether that system, this system of frontal and temporal areas, contains meaningful dissociations, whether some brain areas show different signatures, whether we see clear evidence such that damage to some areas leads to different kinds of deficits compared to other areas. And such associations have certainly been postulated, but I would argue that there is no compelling evidence of clear replicable differences, so that, say, even the frontal regions versus the temporal regions do clearly different things. We find across dozens and dozens of experiments very similar functional profiles. And this is not just a function of the signal being temporally blurry in fMRI. We find similar things in intracranial recordings. This is not to say that there's no differences in there, and that there's no component parts that are truly doing something different. It's either that the methods we currently have are not good to address those questions, or the distinctions that we come with a priori are not along the right lines. And so to try to address the latter, we're now doing a lot of work trying to understand the dimensionality of neural responses to language, using all sorts of neural data to try to see whether, well, first of all, understanding the dimensionality of the response is an important goal as in of itself, but also trying to see whether some distinctions may fall out from these more bottom-up approaches that we just fail to see when we come in with our clever hypothesis and try to search for particular splits.
So on that note, though, just so I understand, I mean, there seems to be a trend overall that when you do decoding approaches and when you look for information with MVPA and other approaches, you see things everywhere and they bleed into everything else. And, people, Ben Hayes has written an article saying that prefrontal cortex is really premotor cortex. But nevertheless, right, you would agree in stroke, for example, most patients that we see start with the global aphasia, and the majority peel back into more of an expressive aphasia, right? In other words, that's the recovery pattern we see the most, right? So they're having real trouble understanding things, and then they stop having trouble understanding things. So what I'm just trying to understand is, why does one see these distinct phenotypes in patients if there's no separation in the way that you're talking about?
Well, so again, this is not, I think the patterns that we see can arise from damage to connections between this system and output and input systems. So again, just like the speech perception system I mentioned, which is the input to my high-level language system during comprehension, there's a separate system that supports articulation. So this is just motor outputting planning and outputting phonological representations. So this is past the level where you're retrieving the words, organizing them into a phrase or a sentence, and then you send it down to the motor control system.
Although expressive aphasia is not just dysarthria, right? It's not just.
Oh no, it's not just arthria. No, it's not that there's problems moving the articulators. Right. There is something with planning sets of articulatory commands. You can stick your tongue out and you can do all this stuff, but you can't do the sequence of phonological units.
I get it. So I see. So you have partition between, as you said, the perceptual, the comprehension, and then you've gotten to the
motor production as well.
Production. Yeah. Okay, that's fine. So, and then with respect to your results that you talked about, Fedorenko, Vali, and stuff that I really like.
John froze. I feel like it's a part of the Learning Salon that every week John should have some issue with internet.
Gone or what?
You're back now, but
You're back, but your face is a cubist painting. Okay, now it's gone. Well, we will wait for him to reconnect.
Yep.
But the regulars would know this is a common event.
Yeah, sorry. I do that for Ida.
problem.
She'd be really upset if I didn't do it.
Yeah.
So some people, I think, would object to your global aphasics left hemisphere not leading language by saying that maybe some linguistic abilities have been retained in the right hemisphere. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you think the right hemisphere is doing, which I don't think anybody really does, honestly. And so so there are some claims about the right hemisphere doing some language-related things, about the right hemisphere supporting some aspects of non-literal language processing or lexical semantic processing. But there's two things to say. So one is that the functional MRI responses clearly suggest that the left or the right hemisphere language homotopes are not engaging in non-linguistic tasks. So there's a little less specialization in the right hemisphere, but it's actually still quite specialized.
Mhm.
So we have something that we're working on
Right.
describing this. So that's, just contra the idea that the right hemisphere is generally more engaged in non-linguistic cognition. But, whether some linguistic abilities are preserved, yeah, I mean, it's hard to completely rule that out. Sure, there may be some right hemisphere language stuff that helps. But then again, you look at fMRI responses and you look at other kinds of data. For example, you look at kids who grow up without linguistic input. And then, so these are, for example, deaf kids born to hearing parents, which is the majority of deaf kids, whose parents, of course, will not have known sign language. They don't have a reason to learn it until they have a deaf kid, usually. And you ask, do these kids grow up and they have fundamental difficulties in thinking, right? Do they? And they don't. It turns out that without language, you can learn to do math. You can learn to reason about the world. Of course, it's helpful to have language. It's much easier to teach somebody using linguistic instruction, for sure. But it's not fundamentally seems to be a precursor to complex thought, with the sole exception of some aspects of theory of mind. That's one place where it seems like having access to linguistic representations is very useful.
I mean, I just so you know, I ask it. I'm on your side about this. I think it's like a weak.
I'm happy for you
attempt
not to be. We don't have to all agree.
No. But on this thing, I am. No, now we'll get to where I'm. Now I want to get to the two juicy things,
Sure.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is very interesting. So I find it. I just was wondering, when you make the finding, and this is something that I know Melanie will bring up, and we've talked about this, and it's great to have you here, is you say that you couldn't find any separation between, word meaning and combinatorial processing. Okay. Nevertheless, you do make a conceptual distinction between word meaning and combinatorial processing, because those are the things that you're using to go looking for a separation or not. So on the one hand, you fail to see a separation. And am I allowed to use the word syntax or combinatorial processing?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Not
syntax is
correct?
good. Yeah. Just some
Okay,
people get upset whenever.
So in other words, if I understand, okay, good. I didn't want to commit a faux pas. So given that you're saying that you're not finding separation within the language system when you go looking between semantics and syntax, what I want to know is, what is the consequence of that? In other words, is it a kind of maybe the idea that you've got this part of the brain that's capable of having these subspaces that are in the same part of the brain that can do syntax and semantics? In other words, you don't have separate areas, you just have multidimensional subspaces. One does semantics, one does syntax, but it's the same neurons. Or are you denying through this finding that there's a difference between semantics and syntax? In other words, what are you actually saying with this? Is just saying that we don't know how it's organized and packed in the brain, or are you making a deeper conceptual point?
It's a very good question, John. I mean, some of this I cannot quite deny the distinction yet, but let me just like give you a brief kind of history of the field of language research. So looking for that distinction is historically grounded in generative linguistic tradition, where original proposals by Chomsky and others were basically that you have a mental lexicon, you store a bunch of word meanings, and then you have very abstract combinatorial rules, like a sentence is made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. And you kind of fill in the words in the relevant slots, and you have, well-formed, meaningful sentences. Now, as soon as those proposals were put forward, there was pushback on all fronts. There was pushback from other linguists who were saying, wait a second, these abstract rules based on categories like nouns and verbs are not going to get you very far. Like a very famous example there is verbs, right? Where verbs have very particular subcategorization, so-called subcategorization requirements, which other words they connect to and how. There was pushback from computational linguists who started building parsers, trying to figure out the dependency among words and text using these abstract kinds of rules, and that just didn't go anywhere at all. And then there was pushback from psycholinguists who were saying, look, there's a bunch of evidence suggesting that people keep very careful track of information about which particular words occur in which particular context. And so this shift began from these kind of abstract syntactic construals to what's called lexicalized grammars, where part of what grammar is kind of stored along with word meanings. So each word has information stored with it about how that word can, go into phrases with other words. Moreover, a long conception in language research is, language is this rich combinatorial system. People would say so often, I can give you a sentence and you've never heard it before and you'll understand it. And that's all absolutely true. But there's a huge amount of reuse in language. And that has not been appreciated until about 20 years ago. And now it's kind of getting more and more and more appreciated.
So the deep point, I think, so just to understand, go ahead, finish, because
we store and reuse,
finish.
like we store and reuse big chunks of language, just like in motor control. We have these pre-computed sequences, right? Memoization, whatever you want to call that, like, whatever terms you think about it. And we reuse those all the time. And that's a big deal. It's not just every time we do this beautiful composition from scratch. And so
absolutely.
All of that said, I think that it doesn't make sense to think about storage regions and computation regions, or storage cells and computation cells. From everything we know about neurobiology, we don't have separate cells that store information versus compute information, to the best of my knowledge. And of course, all of the evidence that now comes from deep learning suggests that the very same units that encode information are also the ones that participate in doing stuff with that information, performing transformations on it.
And that's true of motor skills in motor cortex. Yeah, I mean, motor cortex executes and So, okay, so exactly. Exactly. So the deep point you're making, and I think this is so important for everyone, is that it's not that that meaning is not different from combinatorial processing. No. It's that actually the idea of pure abstract combinatorial processing sucked dry of meaning is just it has meaning in it. So in other words, the meaning issue, if I've understood you correctly, Ev, is that it's even more prominent. And what you're basically saying in your answer to my last question is you're more than happy to have the perceptual apparatus, the language processing apparatus, and then the language articulating apparatus. But to the degree that there's meaning hiding in the intermediate bit, the language processing area, it's everywhere. And it's not just in individual words. It's in the chunks. It's in the grammar. And so meaning becomes the remaining thing to understand.
That's right.
Right? What meaning is. And what's really interesting about your original part of your talk about this extreme functional specialization, right, which doesn't spill over into the other areas. And even in the right hemisphere, you see evidence for that functional specialization, means that whatever this intermediate thing is, this meaning thing that bleeds over even into sentences, is very special, right? And I'm just wondering, And so my last two questions, I promise, Ida, because I'm on a roll, is what I'm trying to understand is, if meaning is in there, and meaning is a very important part of other forms of thinking, including interpreting visual meanings that you talked about, can you just help me with my cognitive dissonance between meaning being so important to this region, but it being meaning tied so strongly to language that you can do meaning work as a human in other areas of thinking, like deaf children that you mentioned.
Right.
So meaning is very, very important, and yet it can duplicate itself outside the language system. Is that the way you see it?
Sure. You can talk about duplication if you want. I mean, I generally think of meaning and our understanding of the world as separate from the language system. And that's where interesting debates start happening about the language models, where these language models often get critiqued for not having a real understanding of language, like with respect to the world. And how can they possibly get that understanding? They're language models. They're trained on corpora. So, of course, all they can infer.
So what is it? So just to pin you down on this, because it's going to get to my last question about,
sure.
GPT-3. What do you, so I just need to understand, one of the big mysteries, right, and it's been studied in non-human primates, is the meaning of individual words. Let's just get to that. What does it mean to understand what a word means? And the work done that you can learn associations between words and responses without really understanding them. So there's word meaning, and then there's meaning outside the language system for, I don't know, scenes and models of the world.
Objects,
so
events.
What do you mean by, what is word meaning? So what's word meaning? What is word meaning?
Well, I mean, in a very kind of abstract way, it's basically an association between a string of sounds and a string of signs, if we're talking about sign language, and some aspect of the world, right? Like, you come into the world, you don't know any language, obviously. You have a visual system, different individuals may have a visual system, an auditory system, tactile system. You're starting to learn that there are some regularities in the world. You're starting to assemble this world knowledge about objects, about the physics of the world, about social interactions, about how it feels good to be with a conspecific, right? All the good social stuff. Then you're learning. And then you're also noticing that humans make sounds or, gesture with them, like move their hands if you're, again, in a science-speaking environment. And then at some point, you're starting to notice that there's correlations in there as well. It so happens that every time your mom says bear, there is likely this thing in the background that's a toy, that's a bear, right? And then you kind of, at some point, it must click that there's this non-randomness in the sounds that your, caretakers make and the world. And then from then on, you can then start picking up on these co-occurrences and make these links. What exactly is word meaning?
The thing about that, Ev, but the thing about that, Ev, is I don't know what it means when you start thinking about the meaning of the word irony or words like that, where it seems to me just an associative learning. But anyway, we won't go there. Just a last point about GPT-3.
We're going to be on the same. Wait. John, I'm sorry. You've been going on for a while. I feel like it's becoming like watching a dialogue as opposed to the way that it's usually. We will get to GPT-3. We are all going to ask questions, and we will come back to you to ask it. I feel like I will ask some things about it. Melanie will. Oh, wow. So maybe you want to ask that while I answer the door.
Okay, good. I sent someone to ring her doorbell. Now, Melanie and I did a little experiment. I asked Melanie Mitchell to put some questions into GPT-3, I believe it was. She can tell us. And basically, I find your result that the models that perform best on next word prediction are the ones that best predict human neural data. I consider it as the glass half empty, because GPT-3 makes ridiculous meaning mistakes that humans don't. And so it just means that meaning is just still not there, right?
It depends on what you mean by meaning.
Because they just make the most stupid errors, right? That a human would never make, right?
So it depends on what kind of, look, I mean, if they're making...
can actually give the example.
Okay, give your example.
They just make errors. Melanie ran them, and we were just asking, for example, in Romeo and Juliet, the priest was told by Juliet that she was going to pretend to die and he should tell Romeo and blah, blah, blah. And you ask questions to GPT-3 to explain what was Juliet thinking, that it makes absurd errors, right?
Of course, because it
So in
can't
other words, it
reason.
just
These
doesn't
models can't
understand that unless
reason.
it's
You're
right.
asking
Okay,
these
so
models to
meaning is
reason.
not there.
I don't
Right,
think so.
okay.
I mean, and in fact, like, if I was giving a longer talk, I would also talk about how the language system actually has relatively short context that it pays attention to. So it doesn't seem to pay attention to context beyond a few words back. Okay, that's very short. So what I think the language system is doing is getting kind of, maybe event level representations, get some approximation of those, and then ships them down to downstream areas that perform, social, spatial reasoning on those inputs.
Okay.
And
So I
that's
understand back. So I see. So in other words, given that short horizon that you just described, maybe that explains why you get this very interesting correlation between the deep neural networks and the language system, because they're not going very deep.
exactly. And I think the language system is the stage between perception and then downstream reasoning. And this is just a system we have for mapping that onto a code, which we can use to share thoughts with one another.
Perfect. That sounds really plausible to me. Okay, I will
good.
stop there before I get told off again.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, John. So first of all, thank you so much for your talk, and thank you for joining us. It's definitely, it's like a marathon. The Learning Salon is the marathon of like Q&A usually. And there will be more folks asking questions, etc.
Yeah.
I'll first start by saying, as someone who uses, who has been using computational models for a very long time, who works at a place where we try to combine, let's say, various different kinds of language models with RL and then compare it to human-like stuff. I find that nobody in the tech world thinks GPT-3 is a good model of either the brain or human language. It's just good for certain uses, like certain products, etc. And there is a lot of criticism of it because it just like does a lot of things wrong. It amplifies biases. The associations or the kinds of co-occurrence matrices that one can get from any corpus, I think we think of them more in terms of, associative memory, just like what are the concepts in because of the particular culture of the corpus that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. What are concepts that are like associated with one another? So it's a little bit more like what associations would come up when something else is there. It's not as much really about language. It's more about sort of concepts per se. So it doesn't have to do anything with grammar, for instance. It has only to do with what are things that might co-occur. And I go to a lot of technical talks about how it tries to disambiguate and everything. So we see it as like a very bad model that works for products, and we're trying to figure out how to make it maybe a little bit more human-like. And then I'm trying to understand how this useful engineering-wise, but cognitively bad model, why is it even a good candidate to compare? But then I think about why would it be successful in its results? Then I think about what functional regions were taken. For instance, I'm guessing you showed sentence versus nonsense to people, and that's how you localize those functional areas in each of the people. And then that's a certain number of voxels. I don't know how many. I'm going to say 5,000. I don't know. Like how many voxels?
Sure, that's about right. Yeah.
Yeah, so let's say there's 5,000 voxels. And then how many weights do you have in the GPT-3 that are going to be matched to this 5,000? Do you know how many weights you have?
Well, we take like one layer, which is usually close to the output, but not the last one.
So you take one layer, not the last one. How do you choose which layer?
If we see which one predicts best on the next word prediction task.
I see. So a layer that predicts best behaviorally the next word. Right. And do you know how many weights there are in this? Just number of parameters?
I don't know off the top of my head, a few hundred. I don't know.
Few hundred? My guess is
in a layer, yeah. I think so.
But
maybe more, yeah. Well, it depends on the size. Yeah, like, like Excel, like the core, like the trimmed down one is probably a few hundred. And then I think, the other ones are bigger.
Okay. So there is the conversation started with different parts of the language system don't do the same thing. They're so different, and it's important to take each functional area differently. And then we end up in a place where we take all of the voxels in all of the functional areas everywhere in the brain and compare them to next word prediction. So it's a little counterintuitive to me in terms of consistency of the methods.
I'm not sure sorry, maybe I misunderstood what you're saying, but we're looking, when we're modeling the brain responses, we're restricting it to the language system. So we're not doing the whole brain. We're taking the system that we think is doing language in humans,
right,
and we're taking these models and we're,
which you said, I know that the brain doesn't have only 500 voxels. And that's what I meant by functional localization first. But in the beginning of your talk, you were saying different parts of the language system are doing different things.
No. Sorry, I was saying they're doing the same thing.
I see.
Or
so
at least we haven't.
Prefrontal cortex and temporal cortex and everything else in the language system are all doing exactly the same thing?
We don't know what they're doing. There are no clear functional dissociations that have been discovered with the best methods we have. That's right.
Well, in the tests that have been done, but you really believe that functionally there is no difference just because you haven't tested it yet?
No, I don't think. I think we've tested about all of the hypotheses that are out there for the kinds of distinctions. Most of them have to do with structure versus meaning in some way or other. And as I said, this whole set of areas, this whole set of temporal and frontal areas seem to show very similar profiles. And this is not a limitation of fMRI. You find similar things with intracranial recordings. They're functionally very, very similar, which is, it doesn't necessarily follow that they all do exactly the same thing, but there is likely a lot of redundancy in that system.
So then we come to the point where the layer of a neural network that predicts the next word compared to activation of all of these voxels at the same time when the human is predicting the next word, or what is happening?
When the human is just reading sentences or listening to sentences or reading stories or whatever. Yeah. So we get for each sentence or each phrase or whatever the stimuli are, we get a set of neural responses, we get a set of model weights, and then we train a regression between them.
Regression. I see. It's just a regression.
Linear regression. Yeah.
So everything is, so just to understand, so everything has a Gaussian distribution, a normal distribution, and that's why you use linear regression?
Well, linear regression is just the simplest tool with fewest assumptions.
Well, the assumption is that things should be normally distributed. So did you test that like the weights and all of the fMRI results also were normally distributed?
I don't know if I can speak to those details to you. I'm sorry, I would have to.
The reason I'm asking is because those are the exact details that my kind of work cares about, right? So we were speaking about.
But tell me why exactly, because like some of the stuff that you prefaced your question with, I don't think I fully agree with. So you're saying these models are not good.
They're not good models. No, they're not.
It depends on what you mean by that. So these models, well, can I just say like a few things? So I think they're actually really good models of formal linguistic competence. They do things that people said machines, statistical language models would never be able to learn. They learn abstraction. They learn long distance dependencies, long distance agreement. They capture a lot about behavioral responses of humans to sentences, like they predict complexity in just the right places in the sentence. So there's a lot of stuff that they do really well in terms of their behavior that seems to mirror behavior and knowledge of humans with respect to formal competence. Now, where criticisms often come in is that these models, like John was saying, they can't reason. They can't understand anything about embodied representations, because how can they, right? They're just trained on language corpora. But from those statistical regularities, they extract a lot of very useful information, which to some extent, of course, will reflect world knowledge, right? Because language reflects our experiences, but it's just a language model. It's a model that learns linguistic patterns, linguistic regularities. And for that, I think they're actually not bad models.
I will repeat what I said before. They are useful models, and I agree with the word that you used, useful, as in for some purposes, they seem to be producing within parameters, really restricted parameters, good predictions. But as Melanie, I think I shouldn't be talking about this aspect of it because Melanie is the person who has done a lot more work on this. So I'm just going to go back to the reason I am very concerned about the methods. First, linear regression is, if the assumptions don't fit with the data, we can't really interpret linear regression. So that's one concern I have. Another concern I have is I want to know exactly what number of parameters are being fit with how many number of parameters, because it seems like it's 5,000 voxels on this side, and then there is, I would think the layer that you took is maybe probably 200 by 200 or something, but let's assume that you only took a couple of hundred parameters from there, as opposed to the actual large number of parameters that exist. Let's say that it was just that. So matching between a couple of hundred and 5,000 using linear regression, I'm just a little
It's not restricted to
about
linear regression. You can do representation similarity analysis. You capture the same patterns.
I would have the same issues with that, actually, but I have also issues with, like, the kind of unconstrained use of. So for instance, in the CNN case, there was very clear architectural priors about different layers and how, for instance, this corresponds to different layers. And so I'm a little...
You mean how different layers correspond to, like, different brain stages, like the models inspired by ventral stream architecture, or?
Yes, I'm saying that you made that comparison in the beginning.
Yep.
There are obviously critiques even to that, whether that is a good model. And there are some people showing that the adversarial examples for the CNNs are really bad compared to humans. And then there are some additions to that, etc. But it's a field that has been going on now for over a decade. But you made the comparison to that, and I feel like the comparison doesn't quite match for various reasons, including the fact that CNNs are very different in terms of being, we know what's going on in terms of the bottom-up, how the convolution works across the layers compared to GPT. So I have a lot of methodological issues with this, but I'm going to wait for Melanie to discuss, because it seems like that premise is where we do seem to disagree whether GPT-3 is a reasonable brain-like or candidate for being a brain-like model or not. And it seems like we don't even agree whether it's behaviorally, a cognitively reasonable model. I feel like Melanie might be better situated to address that, but also ask her other questions. So
look, but I also say I'm definitely not saying that GPT is how the human brain solves language. I'm definitely not saying that. What I'm saying is that the fact that some of these models provide a reasonable fit with the methods that we're using allows us then to take these models apart, right? And try to reverse engineer, try to understand what about these models is it that makes them better or worse fit to human neural or behavioral data, right? Models are just much more susceptible to probing, to manipulations than human brains are. And if there's a model that captures something about human neural responses, that's potentially a useful tool to have.
I think broadly, all of us who are in the field of combining modeling and neuroscience believe that. However, with these particular models and what would count as a model that we could take a look at, given the architecturally we know how they are created, as opposed to we know a lot about the architecture of the brain, I don't agree that just performing or doing better is enough to assume that there are similar mechanisms. But I'll defer to Melanie for now.
Okay. Sure.
Hi there.
Good to see you.
This is really fascinating. I have so many questions. I'm not sure which one to ask first, but let me just ask, since we're talking about these large language models. I'll ask a question that actually somebody else posed in the questions, but asked me to ask.
Sorry, I haven't been tracking that.
Yeah. So was asking about, like, what were the control experiments you did in this study of fitting language models to human neural responses? I mean, you could think of trying to have a system that learns, like, from a visual a transformer system like GPT-3 or something that learns a visual task, or learns some nonsense language and has very high perplexity in whatever field it was trained on. But now let's compare that with your human language responses, and it shouldn't be a good fit, right?
Yeah. No, that's so we haven't done any controls with models trained on non-linguistic input. We have looked at performance of these models that are not trained. And that's one of the puzzling aspects to me still, of most puzzling results there, that some of these models already do quite well. in predicting responses. I mean, much worse than trained models, but reasonably well, suggesting that there's something about how information flows. Of course, that they're untrained, but then there is a decoder on top. So like you can map word responses to human responses, but the model has not been trained to do word prediction task. Yeah, though those are kind of the main controls we've done. We've also looked at whether these models' performance on other language tasks bears similar predictive relationship to the brain. Like, is it the case that models that do well on any language task will better predict human neural responses? And that's just not true. So, like judging how well formed a sentence is grammatically, or judging, the sentiment of the sentence, like none of those seem to bear. So that relationship seems selective to next word prediction, suggesting that something may be useful about that task as a training function for both human language system and the machine ones, presumably because it's a kind of task that forces you to pay attention to all sorts of regularities, right? Like to do that task well, you have to pay attention to the grammar, to the local co-occurrences, to the kind of slightly larger semantic context, and so
on. So this is getting back to John's question. What is your interpretation of that result? I mean, it's a very striking result, right? That you get a good fit from these language models, which, if you actually, try use them, sometimes they are human-like, and sometimes they're not, and they can. People don't really understand exactly what kind of internal representations they're using, so what's your interpretation?
Well, I think they're relatively, I don't want to say unsophisticated, not to diminish them, but I think they're just low-level statistical learners, like the language module in the brain, if you will. If you want your model to reason, then you'll want to take this language model, combine it with something that does reasoning, and then maybe you'll have something that approximates human understanding, human-like understanding. And the reasoning will probably have to involve, different components as well, right? We know that social reasoning and physical reasoning are distinct in the human mind and brain. World knowledge and is separate also from kind of your social understanding of others' intents when they communicate. So that's another system that's separable in humans. And we're just working on a position paper with Kyle Mahowald and Anya Ivanova and others, trying to make that case that instead of trying to keep making these models bigger and bigger and expecting that they will do some kind of generalized AI, you want to treat them as just a system that does language in the human brain, which is not a system that does your thinking, and use it as a component in a multi-componential system where these specialized, modules or whatever parts do their own thing, division of labor.
So you're saying the language system, your interpretation, my understanding is that the language system in the brain doesn't do thinking.
It absolutely does not. We know that it does not. It's not just that is not an interpretation. That one is an empirical fact.
And so it does not, I mean, but does it capture this, it does capture some semantics?
It reflects some semantics, of course. To use language, you have to have a mapping between words or constructions and some parts of the world, right? So that's our language knowledge. But you can also perform reasoning on those abstract representations without converting them to a verbal code.
So the question that I actually asked in the question section is not about AI. It's about non-human animals and their linguistic capabilities. It's a really controversial area.
Yeah.
And I wonder if your kinds of methods and your findings can say anything about that controversy, with chimps, parrots, what have you, that people have tried to teach language to.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably to say there, like in the succinct way as possible, is I think in general, scientists have long wanted to think that humans are very special. And so there has long been a search for some qualitative change that happened in our brains, some like new circuit emerging, new brain region, some new computation that just wasn't possible in non-human brains. And I think by far the most likely null hypothesis is just a scaled up brain version, scaled up primate brain, which actually is what it's predicted to be given our body size. And in light of that, I think people also have vastly underestimated the importance of a large storage capacity. So I think instead of looking for some fundamentally new computations, it may be worth seriously thinking about what we gain from being able to store more bits of information about the world, more communicative signals. And perhaps some of the combinatorial power that we have emerges from that, because when you can store more information, you can make generalizations more easily. You can abstract away over larger sets of elements, larger sets of components. And so do I think there is a qualitative change between our communication system and that of other animals? I would bet on no. I mean, I don't have a horse in that race, but I think it's a largely scaled up version of the animal systems. And that's where, go ahead.
Yeah. So do chimps have a language, analogous language area of their brain?
They have homologous systems. I mean, they have some communication. Again, I think, so I didn't get to talk about that part, but what I think happened is that humans got smarter for whatever reason. I mean, it doesn't have to be because of this increased storage capacity, although I think that's kind of the, simplest story to tell. And as their thinking became more sophisticated, they had a need to talk about it. Chimps have a communication system that serves their purposes. Whatever they want to convey to each other, they can do using the limited number of vocalizations they have. When you have a lot on your head and you're a social species, you'll want to talk about it. And that, of course, can lead to further increases in, potentially social sophistication, maybe even in reasoning, maybe in planning and things like that. Language can certainly help you structure certain ideas, but it's definitely not the case that you need language to think. I don't know if that helped.
John is saying something.
Sorry, was the
John,
question?
Yeah, just a little component to that.
So, John, please give us a minute because you've had a long time. Let's give us a little bit of time. So I was wondering, Melanie. So was what you were saying? I'm a little confused by the answers because the answer of if there's so much going on in the head, they have to communicate it somewhere. I find it an unsatisfactory answer. I personally enjoy reading papers about chimps and other primates' communication, whether it's based on their vocalizations, whether it's based on their ability to learn various kinds of sequences for interaction, whether they teach it to their kids or not, which I guess they don't, even if humans have achieved something and it's hard to achieve it again. So it seems like there is a difference in that capacity. And I'm not interested in humans being special. I don't think anybody's special. I do want to understand architecturally what's the difference. And I haven't found a satisfactory answer about that in any of the literature that I've seen. So I think maybe, Melanie, what you were asking was whether there is some function that these similar homologous areas are doing also in animals. And clearly that function is not to have a full-on language with syntax and semantics the way we have it. What is it doing? Maybe that's a kind of
storing. I would say it's storing communicative signals. I mean, those signals have to be stored.
So so these are memory regions, basically.
I think the whole brain is a memory region.
Okay, we think very differently about the brain, extremely differently. Like, I feel like
that's okay.
I'm a little worried that this is getting to the kind of,
I think memory is the core component of computation.
Everyone thinks that, but that doesn't mean the whole brain is the memory system. So I think maybe I wait for Melanie to continue.
Yeah, well, GPT-3, let's look at GPT-20 or something like that. It's going to have a huge memory, right? And it's going to remember everything that's ever been written by humans. But
it's still not going to think.
Well, but didn't you just say memories? All the thinking is all about.
But if it's only exposed to linguistic co-occurrences, it's still not going to learn about the world. It's still not going to have social reasoning about intents and stuff. How will it learn that if it only gets information from co-occurrences? Then all it's going to learn is.
That's fair. So let's recap. So the entire brain is memory. The language system is memory. What is thinking? These are the two things that you said. You said the entire brain is just a memory system. Language is just a memory system. what is the thinking? Where does the thinking happen?
Well, I mean, thinking is efficient use of a lot of memory resources, but it's not, I mean, so to be fair, there is a system in our brain, which is known as the multiple demand system, that doesn't seem to store that much information. It's a flexible resource that you use to learn novel information, use to learn novel tasks, things like math and logic and computer code processing load on that system. So that system is, and it remains flexible. In animal studies, you find that cells in that system will learn preferences that are task dependent. So one cell will respond selectively to, say, cats versus dogs, and then the task demands change, and the very same cell will now respond to, say, upper versus lower part of the visual field or something like that. So it's supporting task-directed cognition. So that system is not, I think, a pure memory store, but I think most of the other systems is storing with some level of abstraction information that we acquire from the world. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't see how it can be any other way, honestly.
There's a lot of other ways. So for those who are not familiar with these terms, John Duncan, among other folks who work on the prefrontal cortex, had a theory that the prefrontal cortex is a multiple demand system and it's domain general. This idea has been very much disagreed by a lot of people. Even when I had a conversation with John Duncan and looked at some particular parts of his review, if you read later reviews, there are parts where they're like, oh, but yes, Brodmann area 10 and some parts of PFC have specialization. There's a lot of discussion about specialization in different parts of this multiple demand system. Given I have worked on task sets and the prefrontal cortex since my PhD, this is an area where I've been involved in a lot of conversations, and I still am. So it's not a, let's say, so not a lot of people think that all of the prefrontal cortex is just a multiple demand system. But okay, so
I don't know if it's not a lot of people. There's a lot of people who have that construal. I mean, I don't know if it makes sense to talk about how many people are on which side of the debate, but the idea of the multiple demand system. I think the certainty
with which you were talking, that's the reason I'm trying to explain to, especially to students who might be watching this and they might not be aware that obviously specialization in prefrontal cortex is not your main area. So I want to make sure that the certainty.
Well, it is actually my main area. I was the one who showed that parts of the prefrontal cortex are highly specialized for language, which wasn't shown before.
Well, language is your specialization and the extent to which language involves with prefrontal cortex. But in your work, I'm not aware of work on other things about the prefrontal cortex. So I'm sorry.
I've worked on the multiple demand system. I showed that system is very domain general using individual subject analysis.
Yes. I understand that John Duncan kind of
we're collaborators on that work. Yeah,
I understand. That work is not, I would say, as I wouldn't ascribe the kind of certainty with which you were mentioning. So I just wanted to make sure that people are aware that, in fact, there's a lot of disagreements with that work. Even John Duncan himself, again, I have discussed this with him. I think he has definitely noticed the specialization in some parts of the prefrontal cortex. So
I mean, everything I say is controversial to some people. I mean, I'm certainly not saying I'm probably wrong about all sorts of stuff, but I'm just giving you my take on what I've learned.
Right. We are in a scientific discussion. Obviously, it's not about everything you say is controversial to someone, because it's not a conversation with a politician, of course. This is a conversation about science. So it's important, especially to trainees and people from other fields, to know that certainty with which a sentence is asserted doesn't mean that that is actually accepted as broadly. And I think it's important, given this is a salon, for that to be clear to everyone. Another thing I would say is that for those, again, who don't know, in fact, MIT is a place where it's associated with people arguing for functional specialization in certain parts, for instance, FFA, for instance, PPA, etc. And then there's more stories to it later on, or the other minds specializations of TPJ. And Ev, obviously, historically, you joined MIT as a postdoc, I think. And
as a graduate student.
As a graduate student. And then your specialization was something that I really appreciated. It was the work that the first time that I heard your name was based on word versus non-word. That you were showing that when there was people who didn't know, I think it was your work, right? That when people learned words, there was a particular word area that would start, but it wasn't there before, right? That was the...
No, I mean, I think you may be thinking of the methods for localizing language regions, which is based on the contrast of sentences versus non-word lists. but
No,
that's
I'm
like a
thinking about a study in which people were learning learning to write. People who didn't know how to write, and
I
then
don't
they
think that's
started.
me.
Okay, maybe that was not you. Okay, so here is again the confusion for me. Specialization versus everything is one blob. I'm having difficulty kind of figuring out where you stand on that, because on the one hand there is this idea that there is a bunch of blobs that they all do this thing that is language, but really that's just predicting the next word. And then
I don't know what you mean by predicting the next word. So, I mean, it is uncontroversially true that the brain is made up of multiple large-scale networks. Like that is, I think,
yes,
most people
definitely
agree. So one of
yes,
those systems is a
I agree
system
with that.
that becomes specialized for language as we learn language. I don't think that system is specialized for language when we're born, because that doesn't make sense, because we don't know language when we come into the world. As we start learning language, we have to store that information somewhere, the mapping between forms and meanings. And I think the system that looks specialized in adult brains is the system where that knowledge is stored. So this is one of the systems in the adult brain. Now, the question of subdivision, and that is a system that processes word meanings, and it does linguistic composition without clear spatial segregation between the two, to the best we can tell right now. Now, that system is separate from the rest of the systems. Of course, it interacts with other systems. Everything in the brain interacts in some way or other. But that system is an extended set of frontal and temporal regions, and the subdivisions within it, I think, are controversial. We have not seen clear evidence of, say, even frontal regions versus temporal regions doing very different things. Instead, everywhere within that system that you look, you find that there's sensitivity to word meanings, and there's sensitivity to combinatorics. So stronger responses to composed things than unconnected lists of words.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I will invite John Rosky to ask his question. I don't think we are on the same kind of, my goal is not antagonization. I'm really trying to discuss them scientifically, but I think I'm going to kind of, but I think that
I don't feel antagonized. I just don't want stuff attributed to me that I didn't say.
I think this idea that the brain has different networks doesn't mean that the brain is just a couple of blobs and all of it does the same thing. I think
I didn't say it's a couple of blobs. It's like dozens of different networks.
Dozens is very small.
Well, I mean, maybe it's more.
And
I
the
don't know.
differentiation, I think it counts as first too. Oh, this is another conversation going on there. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. John, go ahead. Ask your questions.
Hello. Hi, Ev.
Hi.
I think we met, actually, I was trying to think I've met you before. And I think I met you back actually in Moscow in like 2014 or 2015 when you gave like a couple lectures there. It just occurred to me the other day and I was like, oh,
At the Higher School of Economics, maybe?
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that was where it was. Yep. And so it was great to hear this talk because all the recent work you've been doing. And so the most recent one that I'm familiar with is that Shrimp paper. So I'm glad that you focused. Shrimp, did I say that right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I reread it this morning because I thought, okay, maybe that's the one that she'll talk about. I was very happy about it. And so one thing that strikes me in that paper is that you said, I wrote it in my chat. You said like if we take model training to be analogous to human learning in human development, lots of people do that. Then the human cortex might already provide a sufficiently rich structure that allows for rapid acquisition of language, right? So, and I think the results that you showed, were kind of consistent with that, right? So, but then the way you presented it today in your talk, and like from what I know about your past work, it seemed to paint a less innate-esque view of language. So I'm just wondering, if I could get some clarification on what is it? Is it if ANNs are good models, whatever that means, right? Does that support the need for some pre-data language prior? Like without pre-data, there's some prior in the language system that says, I am making you ready for language, and that's it.
I don't think so. I mean, I think we put that speculation in the discussion section because of the result with untrained models.
Right.
That's the result that I am least sure what to make of. So most of the stuff I mean, I do hope that we actually will have a postdoc joining us next year who will look more into that. But for now, most of what I'm doing is trying to understand what it is that makes some of these models provide a reasonable fit to human language processing in the both behavioral in the brain. I don't know what it means. Like, okay, well, I think to postulate innate biases for specific domains, you have to have very, very strong data. And I don't think such data exists for language. In fact, I think you guys had Steve Piantadosi talk to you relatively recently. There's a lot of evidence for very sophisticated learning mechanisms. And I think some of what these models show you is that with enough exposure, you actually can learn from the input pretty sophisticated generalizations, pretty sophisticated linguistic phenomena.
Yeah, so I guess that then, so that it seems like your answer is no, there's not sufficient evidence there, which is fine. But doesn't that then, I'm agnostic, like, so just my background, like I'm an assistant professor of linguistics. So this is like the big, like, there's all these fights, these stupid fights about people arguing these terrible straw man arguments about universal grammar this and blah, blah, right? Yeah. The most boring, it's such a boring argument because it's really just like a David Hume argument, right? The problem of induction, okay? So you're right, naive, no bias whatsoever, you can't learn anything from the data. That's just like a non-starter. So, but if you're really arguing that there isn't sufficient evidence, is it the case that that kind of undermines the RNNs are brain-like? Because you did get that result, that whether you like the result or not, the result really was that there, some random layer of a deep neural net really was a high predictor for some next word prediction, right? So doesn't that undermine the argument that like RNNs are good models for anything language-like, if really we're not, or is it the opposite case that we do accept them as good models, therefore there needs to be some sort of something yeah.
I mean, like I said, I don't have a horse in that race. Like my bet is that there is no innate biases for language and we're just good learners. I think there's social biases. The trained models do much better than untrained models. Why exactly the untrained models still capture something? I'm not sure. Like beyond what we speculate in the paper, I don't know if I have much to say about this without further investigation, without like trying to take that result apart and try to understand what it is about the information flow through these models that may give you some of that fit. But
yeah, I mean, I think there is an interesting hypothesis there that if they are good models, then that's a claim that whatever their architecture bias is, that's making them a good model, right? Because they are capturing something pre-data.
Yeah,
I mean, that's very weird.
Yeah,
right?
But again, I mean, you like one thing to keep in mind is, of course, these models kind of have been evolving in the field for a long time. So some things that worked, stayed in them, right? So you can think of them as selective breeding or something. So, I mean, it's true that in these models, they're providing a fit without any training, but in some ways, some of their architecture has been shaped by years of trying to get these models to do well on these NLP tests. So some of that.
Well, but so you're saying like the fact that humans have iteratively tweaked the model architectures to do a thing is a type of, okay, but that's sort of a divine creator, like Deus Ex Machina explanation, right? Like I can say like Zeus and Hera made brains the way they are, so they made language, right? So or like the benevolent hand of evolution.
Like I said, I don't know. I'm a strong empiricist. I feel like we don't have enough data to say anything conclusive about learning or language innateness at this point.
But then if you have your papers on like the results that they do well on coding, like language coding or something, right? Like I can read.
Who
Python
does well on coding?
Well, people in your MRI experiments with on the.
Well, the language system doesn't respond to coding. The multiple demand system responds to coding.
Right. So now I guess that I'm sort of plagiarizing a bit of Ida's question is then like, right, what is a model of a language system as a language system in absentia of these other networks which seem to be somewhat involved but also aren't involved, but also simultaneously, like it seems like
I'm not sure where the confusion is coming from. Just like language models are statistical learners, right? They get exposed to input and they learn regularities in the input. That's what I think the human language system is doing. It's approximating meaning in a very shallow way and then sends it down to downstream reasoning systems. It's a stage. Like we get, perception, then we get basic language processing where we get the words and relationships among them. We extract some approximation of meaning, and then those are the representation that get sent down, for example, to our social reasoning engines, to our physical reasoning engines, potentially to the domain general kind of abstract problem solving engines, depending on whatever the goals are at hand.
So these things that you've just said, like, and sorry, there were a bunch of them. So I'm going to, like, abstract reasoning, memory, statistical learning. These for you are domain general enough that they are not solely language specific, and then it is.
They're definitely not language specific. They're specific to the domain of reasoning. Like there are systems that respond quite selectively to physical intuitions about the world, like intuitive physics. There's a system that's specialized for social reasoning. Those are not language systems. They're not, because they'll respond to social information and totally non-linguistic stimuli. But the language system can provide input to these systems, because sometimes we get information, about social information through language, and sometimes we can get it through visual cues. So they are domain general in the sense that they're not, people use domain and modality a little bit differently in those contexts. So maybe that's where confusion is coming from.
I'm very, I even put it in the chat. Like, I guess I don't know what the difference is now between, because now we have a language system. Okay, great. And we have some non-language systems, which the language system is necessarily a part of, but also separate from. And
it's not a part of. It's something that provides input to them. I don't think it's a part of them.
Can I just John? I mean, I do think, I have to just say personally, I feel like a number of pennies have dropped for me today from what Eva said, and I actually feel like I'm very convinced overall, and I actually think that I was having real trouble. I see the logic now of the things you put in your first 3 green boxes, and I can actually see the synthesis you're doing. I actually think that what's really helped me is that the language system is kind of shallow, right?
Yeah, it is.
And I absolutely, based on all my experience with patients and, thinking before thought, I never thought that language was thinking and all that. I mean, I agree with you entirely. I think we've just gotten into real trouble thinking that language is far more intelligent than it actually is.
I think that's absolutely right.
And I think that you're showing very beautifully that it's been given far too much credit, and it's far more compartmentalized than we realized.
That's a good sign.
And I think that's really, really fascinating that the data are beginning to suggest that it's been, in a sense, overrated cognitively. And you're making a really lovely case. But just to the innateness issue, I totally get the anti-Chomsky stance of the fact that the combinatorial part and the language meaning part don't dissociate, and that strong Chomskyan view of like pure rule following and then meaning is somewhere else and gets pumped in and all that. I buy everything you're saying there. But there is some innateness, right? But what you're going to say is the reason why chimpanzees suck so badly, even at word meaning, even if they're brought up with baby children, is because they're not, as you said, and it's because they're not thinking in the same way. It's not that they have a lack of a language area.
Yeah, that's
they're
right.
not doing the thinking that language should be used for, so they don't do it. Isn't that
that's right?
What I'm saying?
That's right. I mean, in some way, like some construals of UG, I mean, they're just truisms. Of course, something is different about our brains, so that given exposure to language, we'll learn it, and other animals don't. Like, it's not controversial. What's controversial is how much specialized machinery is innate, as opposed to, for example, a more sophisticated learning mechanism.
Yeah, no, right. In other words, learning and reasoning are more specialized, and language follows downstream of those. Let's stop thinking that language was waiting there, ready in its specialization to be like a catcher's mitt in baseball for thinking. It's backwards, basically, is what you're saying.
Well, I think we're straw manning a bit here, because I don't think the sort of 1950s view of what, people thought whatever the language acquisition something was. I don't think anybody seriously working in language today fully subscribes to that. So that's a straw man. For example, this distinction between pure combinatorics and pure meaning, that's from like 1965. I mean, there are.
I'm very happy you're saying this, but you try to go to language conferences and try to argue with people that there
I
is no
do.
syntax
I'm a linguist.
module. Well,
I'm a linguist.
I'm a linguist too. And
Yeah.
I'm saying that there are still a lot of people who believe in the supremacy of syntax and who think that there is specialized machinery for syntax.
But the
If
distinction
this wasn't the
between, like,
case, I wouldn't have, my papers rejected from like 5 journals every time I tried to publish something.
well, rejection,
People still,
it happens.
I have no problems with this. I'm just saying there's still a lot of people who want to believe that it's all about syntax, that syntax is abstract, and that there's specialization for it.
Well,
You may not think
can't
that,
speak for
and that's
them.
great, but
Yeah. But there are, as I would say, not to play a numbers game, but there are at least as many people who would say, like, look, here's 10 different grammar formalisms for which syntax and semantic, structure is unified, that there's no way to separate them, right? So to say like this falsifies some belief about something, or to say like language is not involved in thinking, or language is more shallow, there are just as many people out there who would say, I accept everything, but I don't accept this small little formal facet of a thing. And so it's not more of a unified front in this way, I think so.
I mean, that's great. And I do have a lot of support from large chunks of linguistics as well. I think it's also worth thinking about something like, oftentimes once you have shown something, when you have demonstrated something like that, language machinery is highly specialized, that syntax and word meanings don't spatially segregate. A lot of people say, well, of course, how else can it be? And yet, before you showed it, we didn't compellingly know this. We didn't know it with the right rigor, methodological rigor. Yeah, Melanie, go ahead.
I'm still confused what you mean by word meanings.
Okay, I mean, I don't know if I have to run soon because I have a 4-year-old, but, I don't know if I can say more beyond. I think there are pointers to some part of our semantic representations. I mean, we store a lot of information about the world. I mean, large chunks of our brain represent, objects, their properties, events, and words, have some connection to them. And so somehow they must have that link.
Right. But I mean, you're talking about the brain here, and you're saying word meanings and syntax don't separate.
That's right.
So what does that mean? What are word meanings in this brain language?
What is word meanings in this link?
I mean, what are you saying? What are you saying? Like, here's this, you see these language areas light up, right? And somehow you're saying like these are syntax and word meanings.
That's right. That any neural unit we've been able to measure down to single cells in some recent work, anything that shows sensitivity to linguistic structure, for example, responding more to sentences than a list of words, or showing sensitivity to a violation, a grammatical violation, or adaptation to repeated syntactic structure, right? The reduction in response when you repeat syntactic structure. Any such unit will also show stronger responses to real words than non-words, suggesting that it's the same units that support combining words together and representing, whatever I call word meanings, right? Some approximation of a link to our knowledge. It just doesn't seem like there's separate units that perform the combinatorics.
That doesn't convince me that. Oh, sorry.
It
doesn't convince you that
they
what?
are.
I just am not convinced that that's word meaning. That recognizing being more sensitive to a word than a non-word has anything to do with word meaning.
Well, I mean, look, something that will map onto a stored representation should elicit a stronger response, right? Like if I give you, at least in the systems that store that representation, right? I mean, I think it's not unlike how the visual system works. Like you store some template representations, like a face template. You find a match in your environment to that template, and that match is resulting in cells firing, and you have neural activity. I think it's similar. We get linguistic input. We recognize familiar chunks. We have linked those chunks previously to some aspects of the world. And so systems that store those mappings will respond more strongly when we get something that we recognize as something we've previously learned, right? I mean, of course, there may be other parts of the brain that respond to novelty and whatever, and we know that there are. But within the language system, the system that cares about things like linguistic structure and responds more to stored meanings compared to like novel strings that don't have meanings, there's no separation in the units that respond to one or the other. Contra proposals that there is some store of words and then some syntax hub, and you kind of, have these two working together getting you
Again, I don't think
That's all I'm saying.
anybody thinks that there's like a syntax.
You're incorrect about that.
There,
I mean, I'll just keep
John,
repeating.
John,
there's a lot of
At least
people.
here, let's just say here. Let's say
Let's just
here,
say
none of
yeah,
us
but
is
John, don't keep
challenging
saying
that.
no
So
one
let's
thinks
like,
it. I mean, it's a disagreement.
no,
Okay.
John, sorry, no, I just want to make sure. I think the point is let's maintain the conversation to those who are here in a manner of speaking, and like
Well, I just feel like it's
I
undermining
think you
people's work when you suddenly say, "Oh, there's actually no disagreement about this thing that
Yeah.
we spent 10 years
Well,
showing." And it's like,
Well, you're
okay,
phrasing it
maybe you're not familiar
sorry,
with
guys,
people who hold different views.
we're not doing this. This is, I'm sorry, Ev, we don't talk on each, we try to not talk on each other. We try to not stay in that space of back and forth that is not scientific. So let's calm down, everybody. I just want to say one thing. It seems like the argument for word versus non-word is about familiarity. Ev, is that correct? Like if it's familiar versus not, it gives a stronger response. It's similar to familiarity and memory as opposed to meaning. So I think if we
It's
take
not
it
familiarity. No, I mean, it's not familiarity. It's about a link to some meaningful aspect of the world. Like you can hear some non-word over and over again, and if it's not linked to anything
right,
that's,
It's
like
not
an
familiar.
object or an event, yeah, it
Right,
can be
so-
familiar but meaningless. So it's not
I mean,
about familiarity.
emojis, just on that note
Right,
for
so-
Melanie.
Yeah.
So I just want to say what Melanie was saying was what is meaning in this aspect of word versus non-word, right? What I'm trying to say is in memory, we have familiarity versus specificity. I think the question that Melanie was asking is not whether a non-word versus a word is going to generate stronger response, but how do we capture meaning or word meaning from the comparison of word versus non-word? It seems like meaning would
We
be
don't.
in
It's just a
different words.
signature.
It seems like meaning would be in words versus one another as opposed to word versus non-word. I think that's maybe
Of course, I'm not
direction.
saying that. Of course, I'm not saying that word meaning is captured in that distinction.
Right. We're not saying, you're saying, we're asking like what are the different dimensions that we're not being confrontational. We're just saying.
Well, I think what's being just to what I think is being said to Melanie's question about meaning, right? In other words, there's lots of things that have meaning that we do inference on. One of my favorite emojis is the one that goes like that. And there's another emoji that goes, there's no word there, but it's filled with meaning. And so I think what's being said here is that one particular bit of machinery that can be used to enhance our meaning ability is language. But meaning comes before language. And there's nothing particularly special about word meaning. It's something that we do, but this has meaning too, and has meaning too. There's nothing special about meaning in words. It's just a particular extra engine that we get a lot more meaning mileage out of, but we have meaning before we have words. There's nothing special.
That's certainly true. And the dimensionality of linguistic meaning is a very interesting question. I mean, it seems like on the order of 100 to 300 dimensions does a reasonable job at capturing something about relationships among words. I mean, but we and many others are working on trying to understand what those dimensions are, because it's not very satisfying to just say a bunch of non-interpretable dimensions.
I do need to thank you a lot for one thing, if not a lot of things. It's that you managed to get John to say language is just the shallow part, because I've had so many disagreements with John because he thinks thinking is language, and I keep telling him it's not. So I'm so happy that this happened.
I have never said that thinking is language. I said, what I've said, let's be very clear about this, I have said that language is a marker for a kind of thinking that only we do. What I said is it's a marker. Language is a marker that we do a special kind of thinking. I have been an adamant opponent. That's why I like Ev's paper on the global aphasic so much. What I've said is that language is just a symptom in humans that they do a kind of thinking that we have the point of having language for. And like Ev said, in the non-human primates, because they don't do that kind of thinking, they don't need that kind of language. That is the point that I've made. Now, what I think is really interesting, what I didn't understand was that the correlation between the deep neural net representation and what humans are doing suggests that the actual role in thinking that language is doing is even less than I said it was. It's just passing it over to the other reasoning system. But I'm the most I'm completely against the idea that language came first and thinking second. I think that's complete
Oh,
nonsense.
great. That's great.
Right.
But do you also agree with Ev and us that humans are not super special necessarily?
No, I don't agree. No, actually, what I mean by that is I think there's a non-linear functional form of inference that we do that makes language worthwhile having. Now, I don't think we know what that special form of inference is that we do that makes language worth having. I don't think Ev has told us what that is.
No, I don't.
Now, I also think that there's something very interesting. I think it's something that sort of Ida and I have talked about is, and you said something about this, is it actually the representation and the memory that you get the credit, not the computations performed on that representation, right? And that really what the difference lies is not cerebellar, basal ganglia, cortical computational operations, it's just what they're operating on has changed. Now, I think, Ida, I also think it's convincing when she says that there are probably algorithms that we have not yet discovered that are also probably worthy of getting the credit. But I don't think that, unless I misunderstood you, Ev, that you are saying that we know what the representational continuum is that makes language worth having.
Right. So that's the domain of what modern linguistic theory looks at. What is the representational way that language, however construed, links these two interfaces, the conceptual interface, however you describe it, right, and the sensory motor interface. That's one of the, even if you're a rabid minimalist linguist, that is like the bare minimum that you think. There are people that have more Baroque ideas about how to interface different stuff, but that's the representational question is what I guess if you asked a spectrum of linguists, that's what they would imagine themselves to cognitively be doing, right? So I think it's a bit of a straw man to say, language is shallow in the sense that nobody thinks it is literally thought except maybe Jerry Fodor, but right. But even he got yelled at, right? So I think today people have quite a new, and again, there's not just one formalism. There's many, many, many different ways to formally articulate that relationship. And large language models are simply another instantiation of that, is to say very banal architecture, smash some data into it, and then see what the predictive accuracy for a layer is, right?
I don't know if there was a question or not.
Well, I just think we argued for 10 minutes about a truism.
I'm not sure. Look,
you're
I'm
saying
not
that
sure
again,
that's
you may. John, sorry to interrupt, but
no. I'm defending you. You can defend yourself better.
I don't feel like I need to defend myself, but I think when you say nobody thinks this is a straw man, you're wrong. I'm sorry, but you're wrong. There's many people who think language and thought are much more closely tied than they turn out to be. It's very controversial for many people. Maybe it's not among the researchers you interact with, but in general, there's a lot of people in the field who feel differently.
Well, certainly they interact. You yourself said they interact, right? It's uncontroversial that whatever the system is, it has to interact. But how the separation goes, that's for us as scientists to figure out, no? Right? And one can have different evidence on what the relationship between the systems is, but
I think we're talking sideways.
We've been told what it is. What I think is so fascinating here and really wonderful about this conversation and really valuable is that what may be interesting is that it really may be much more of the minor partner than it, and I agree with Ev, that people think it is, that really, and that the GPT-3 results, maybe the way to reconcile them is that the language areas are doing something quite shallow and basic like GPT-3, and all the stuff that we've given credit to language for that we all care deeply about lives elsewhere. And I think, if I understand it, that's the point being made. And I think that's actually not something that everyone knows or truism. I think, even I'm very much on the Ev side of the spectrum. I didn't think that either. I didn't know that maybe I can be more of a fan of the GPT-3 result because maybe that's really all the language system is doing, and all the stuff that we think is so great about it is somewhere else. And therefore, I actually feel a little better about it, to be honest.
Good.
I don't think it's trivial or truism that, maybe I was trivial until I learned this, okay? I actually think it's very interesting that it's even stronger ammunition for a position that I always felt, but, I felt like it was a minority position, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I'm glad. Sorry, Melanie.
If language is so separable from thought, do we ever see in stroke patients people who have like language intact but can't do cognitive tasks? I know you've said it's the
Yeah,
other
of
way.
course. Of
Loads
course,
of
there's
them,
cases of
loads
intellectual
them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Prefrontal. I mean, prefrontal cortex patients have all sorts of cognitive problems, and they're completely fluent and perfectly normal at language.
Or developmental intellectual disabilities, or some individuals with neuropsychiatric disorders like psychosis or schizophrenia, where those are disorders of thought. Their language is perfectly fine at the base statistical regularities, but the thought, something is wrong in the how the chain of reasoning goes.
Well, the statistical irregularities might be different as well, because if you ask them for associations, they will have strange associations compared to us.
I meant in terms of like linguistic well-formedness. That's right. Yeah.
So if we looked at their kind of co-occurrence matrices compared to a healthy, not healthy, like a non-schizophrenic adult, it would look different. So I just wanted to say, I would love to, I know you said you have to go, so I'd love to read a couple of questions if that's okay, because they asked us to ask, and I want to make sure that they're honored that way.
You just have to have a hard stop at 6. But
yeah. Oh, great. We have 8 minutes. That's perfectly enough time. And also, so the first one was by William Hockheimer. I think that's how I should pronounce it. And they ask, have any experiments taught subjects fake words with natural statistics, like Blickett, you mentioned, and then see if they get processed differently than in a word-like manner, and maybe after learned forgetting, the word is no longer processed linguistically?
I don't know about the latter part, but yeah, there's work on novel word learning, including how these words get incorporated into the linguistic knowledge store. It seems that consolidation, sleep-based consolidation, is required for that. So once you've consolidated this, then the newly learned word starts behaving effectively like another word in your lexical network. It interferes in similar way with lexical retrieval. It gets processed by language mechanisms. So, which presumably is something that we do every day when we learn new words, right? New words come into our life all the time.
Another question is by Ayuno, but they say that it was already asked by Melanie. So we're going to go to Needy, who asks, does it matter for the kind of work you do that birth-like models may be a good pattern approximator for natural language, but likely do not use the same mechanisms to get at those patterns?
Sorry, I missed the first part. Can you repeat? Sorry.
She asks, does it matter that that birth-like models may be a good pattern approximator of natural language, but likely do not use the same mechanisms to get at those patterns?
That's a good question. I mean, you certainly don't want to equate mechanism when you have two systems, biological or artificial, achieving the same task. Of course, you don't want to infer that the mechanisms are the same. But I think there's a lot to be learned by, like I said, taking these models apart, right? So if you find a model, any model that captures something about human behavior, human brain, then you can try to narrow in on exactly what are the features of the model architecture, training regimen, computational objective, whatever features you think may matter that lead to that good predictive behavior. It still wouldn't necessarily allow you to conclude that the underlying mechanisms are the same, but it will allow you to zero in on the kinds of features that may be useful for artificial models to have to approximate human behavior. And then you can build on that to test, particular stories of, which are more closer to mechanistic level understanding.
Great, thank you. And we have 5 minutes left. And so I guess we can use it to just maybe wrap up. So I put in the chat for those who had asked about multiple demand, the 2000 paper by Duncan and Owen, and the 2001 paper by John Duncan. And then all of these are reviews. And then another review in 2010 by John Duncan. And I'll check with you, Ev, I don't want to say something wrong. I think the first paper you had with John Duncan was a 2012, but I didn't put it in the chat in case you had another one. Okay.
Yeah, that was the first, yeah.
So I'll just add that to the, and then there was the PNAS from 2013. So I'll just add those to the chat so that people can take a look at those. If you compare even the 2000 versus the 2010 reviews that John Duncan wrote, you will see that he even revised his views until then, and there's a lot of conversations there. So take that with a grain of salt. But John was mentioning something, wrapping up about some great achievements of your talk for his thinking. And I think that it's important for us to highlight the kinds of conclusions. Something that I hadn't realized before, as someone who works in, PFC and hippocampus related to tasks and memory a lot, I didn't know how much you think about language areas as more of a specialized memory system. And so I think that's a very interesting thing that you say. And I appreciate you saying that, because I have been using these completely imperfect language models as a stand-in for people's association across different concepts. And I think they are useful for doing cognitive science modeling and studies as a stand-in, because we don't have another access to their concepts internally. So I appreciate you saying that, because you separated that. I still do wonder about which parts of the language system does processing and algorithms, and what kind of algorithms, what's the limits of them, and which parts does the storage. What I understand from you is that you're not saying that all the algorithms are outside the system. You're just saying it's much less, and I appreciate that, because conflating language and thought, I'm very with you. It's kind of a I'm glad. I thought also that it was more of a maybe 70s thing, but I agree with you that I'm pretty sure there would be people now. So thank you for that. So let me see if I recapped everything right. So I think the novel thing for me that I learned was that the language system as a specialized memory network. And I appreciated that in the prefrontal, temporal, all of this makes sense within that view. And then John, what was the highlights that you mentioned earlier? I want to make sure we mention the highlights before we close, given we had like a little bit.
I think the highlight just for me, right, when I try and compare the GPT-3 story and the language system and the Jim DiCarlo, Dan Yemin's story for the ventral stream, and that very interesting data that he now has when it comes to trying to reason about a object in a very strange orientation, in a strange context, suddenly it becomes prefrontal cortex dependent. So I think we're beginning to see this trend towards systems that are quite specialized, impressive, but dumb, and that a lot of the stuff that we call thinking, reasoning, abstraction happens upstream of them, whether it's the ventral stream or the language areas. And I think that means that what we have to answer is, what is that special thing that Ida's favorite area does, generally or specialized, I'm not going to join that makes it reason on top of the computations that the ventral stream and the language areas do. I think that's very, and do you agree, Ev, just finishing, that there's some parallelism there? I mean, I know you're at MIT. Do you see what I'm saying? Or is that not, is it a bridge too far that I've crossed?
No, that was great. That was a very good summary. Yeah.
So it's been very eye-opening for me, actually. I really appreciate it.
That's why we're trying to team up with people like George Tenenbaum now to try to see if we can combine these language models with downstream reasoning systems to see if we can get somewhere closer to human-like understanding, whatever people call that.
And finally, to an argument that we've also had, I think, which is exactly what you were just saying, is that a lot of people who are able to get a lot of work done with deep neural networks, that they seem to be falling short. And we had Tim Behrens on once, and he said, where's inference, right? And I think deep neural networks are doing great jobs, whether it's language, whether it's reinforcement learning, or whether it's ventral stream object recognition. But where they're not doing such a good job is this thing we're calling reasoning and thinking. And it may be what you're saying is the way to go, which is you have to combine a different tradition with that tradition to get them both, right? And I think that's really very exciting in all those different areas.
And as also just to John Roski's comment, I do agree that John sometimes sounds like a dualist, but I don't think that right now we got a Cartesian solution or a Cartesian conclusion. So I think we can, but you come to all of our sessions, so you know the long-term discourse of me telling John, no, that's going a little dualist. Well,
I am a dualist when it comes to the language system versus reasoning. I am a dualist.
That's not Cartesian dualism.
No. It's Cooccurrences dualism. Yes, but no, it's been really. I hope that everyone has understood that there's some synthesis and different areas that we've had on the show coming together in some way. And I think it's certainly crystallized a little bit for me today.
We should have a synthesis session again.
Yeah,
The synthesis sessions are really great, and we invite people who have been our guests for a synthesis session, and the disagreements and everything kind of pays off in those sessions, because all of a sudden we have a number of speakers and people who have engaged with them, so we can have a conversation. Melanie was one of them. So thank you so much for staying so long. I understand you have to go take care of
No,
it.
and thank you very much. And thank you, John, also. You know, a little bit of heat's good.
Yeah. Sorry about we
All right.
usually laugh a little bit more and have heat a little less, but sometimes it gets out
I
of
love
hand.
heat.
Sorry about that.
Bye.
It's all good.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.